I am going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Joe Brumer with the Colorado State University Extension Service, and we're very excited to have him here to visit with us about irrigated pasture and different management considerations for that. So welcome, Joe, and thank you very much for joining us.
You bet. Thanks. Again, it's good to be here today, and I just wanted to start off. When they asked me to talk, I know a lot about irrigated pastures, but it's in reference to cattle production primarily. So there's a little bit of a different mode of thinking here, thinking about sheep and goats. And so if I say something stupid, please forgive me. So I just want to start off, especially when we're here in the West and we're talking about grazing and and if we have these irrigated pasture type systems, we have a leg up on things because, water is our number one limiting factor when it comes to forage production. And so being able to control the amount and the timing of when that water is applied, we can get a lot out of these systems compared to, if we're on like native range type pastures out there. Another advantage when we talk about irrigated pastures is we can add nutrients, inorganic fertilizers if needed. We can add manures and composts as a source of nutrients, especially if we're in some type of an organic production type system. The one thing to kind of keep in mind when it comes to fertilization is about in a pasture situation, about 90% of what goes in the front end of an animal comes out the back end. So unlike if we're producing hay off of a given area, we don't need to put on near as the amount of nutrients as we would in a hay production system, because a lot of that is going to be recycled. It doesn't all become plant available at once. A lot of that has to go through the mineralization process and for it to become plant available again. Some of it's going to volatilize back into the atmosphere as ammonia, that type of thing. But again, a lot of those nutrients will stay in the system. Then the last point there that I have is, we have a lot of control over what's in what we plant in these systems. So we primarily use introduced, improved type species, and these have been, bred and selected to respond to these additions of water and nutrients. And so this can really help even out that productivity over that growing season, even during the kind of that hot part of the summer when plants tend to want to shut down a little bit. So, especially in the kind of the northern half of the U.S., we primarily use cool season species. When it comes to grazing, it's kind of that spring and fall time period is when we tend to be short on pasture. And so by using cool season species, we can kind of lengthen that growing season out. And, these cool seasons are started right now. They're just beginning to kind of go into that fast growth period. And so we're going to see a lot of production coming on here real soon. The other advantage of these cool seasons is they're higher in protein, they're higher in digestibility, higher in energy content compared to, say, a lot of those warm season species. The big disadvantage is they tend to go dormant or kind of semi-dormant during that hot part of or middle part of the summer and goes into what we call that summer slump. So to me, this is really kind of the big bottleneck when it comes to irrigated pastures when we're using these cool season species, is that we have to kind of plan our stocking rates, our carrying capacities based on that midsummer time period when the plant growth is slowed. I just wanted to bring this up. We have in this chart here, the first four are very common irrigated pasture species, cool season species. Then the last three there are native warm season species, but this kind of shows the growth curves over the season, the growing season there. So when we have things like a smooth brome here, it comes on really strong in the spring. Even with water, it tends to kind of go dormant, semi-dormant in the middle part of the summer. And then once things start to cool off in the late summer, early fall, it'll pick up growth again. Tall fescue starts really early, very cold tolerant type species, and has a long spring growth period. But it's one of these that if it has water, in the middle part of the summer, it will continue to grow, although at a slower rate. And then again, like all cool seasons, puts on some growth in that fall time period. Intermediate wheatgrass starts a little bit later and grows a little later into that kind of early summer time period, and tends to have that summer slump, kind of like the smooth brome does, and then picks up in the fall. A very common species that we use is orchard grass. One of the reasons we use it for irrigated pasture is it tends to have a more even forage production over the whole season, again, as long as it has water and a little bit of nutrients. So when you go to the seed store and ask for an irrigated pasture mix, there's a reason why a lot of these mixes have primarily the same species in them, and we want to use species that are have this defoliation tolerance and the rapid recovery. So those would be things like orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow brome. Those would be three very common ones. You'll see a lot of times perennial ryegrass in some of these mixes. Ryegrasses, they come up very quick and establish very quickly, but they're not as winter hardy in a lot of our environments here in the West. So a lot of times they will winter kill and disappear from the composition within 3, 4, 5 years. Kentucky bluegrass is another one that a lot of times we don't think of as a forage species, but there are some forage type Kentucky bluegrasses out there. And Kentucky bluegrass is very grazing tolerant type species. Get into the higher elevations, a lot of times we'll have creeping, the Garrison creeping meadow foxtail, common meadow foxtails that like to grow in those types of environments. Then a couple of legumes down there, white clover, red clover, especially in pasture situations. I like to put some white clover in there. It adds to that diversity of the mix, and all the advantages that you get with having a legume in there. Here's an illustration of orchard grass and kind of what I'm talking about with that quick recovery. This is orchard grass that was grazed or harvested about 30 hours prior. And then if you look here, it was harvested off down here. And in that 30-hour time period, we have, an inch, inch and a half, sometimes 2 inches of regrowth already coming on a species like that. So basically, orchard grass has what we call, and a lot of those species that are defoliation tolerant and have that rapid recovery have what we call continuous tillering. And you can see that illustrated here. We dig up an orchard grass plant, and you see a main tiller here that's, extends on above the slide here. And then you have all these other little tillers down in there. Some of them have just broken the soil surface, where you can see the darker green there where the chlorophylls are being stimulated. You have another tiller over here to the right. It's a little more advanced in growth. But, with this continuous tillering, when you graze something off, it just keeps pumping out those leaves, and again has that very rapid recovery. Compared to some of the species that are less defoliation tolerant, have slow recovery, we do use some of these for irrigated pasture, but again, you have to keep in mind that especially in that midsummer, they tend to want to go kind of dormant, semi-dormant. Things like smooth brome, timothy, reed canary grass, intermediate pubescent wheat grasses, species like that. Alfalfa and birdsfoot trefoil put on this list. Trefoil kind of has a little bit different growth compared to some of the other legumes, a little bit slower recovery. And alfalfa's on here because it doesn't initiate that next crop of tillers or shoots until you get out there, close to about 4 weeks or so. And so that can sometimes, if you're in a grazing situation, kind of slow down the regrowth on alfalfa if you're using it. Here's an example of timothy. Again, that was harvested about 10 days prior. You can see the old stubble out here, and we barely have 3 to 4 inches of new growth here. It's barely at the top of that stubble, again because it has to initiate a whole nother set of tillers down here once it's harvested, and has a high level of bud dormancy. And so it just takes time for those to regrow once they've been harvested, or either for hay or if they've been grazed. So Again, species selection is a huge issue and something to think about. When we get into the actual grazing management, we really want to think about, it's a system out there, and it's a balancing act. We have to keep the animals in mind, we have to keep the plants in mind, and we have to get our stocking rates and carrying capacities correct in order to have a really vigorous functioning system out there. So there's things that affect, the plants and that plant production, that yield potential out there. Definitely our past and current management. We have a 200-acre pivot here on the research farm, and I can speak from experience. If you overgraze an area or a given paddock in there, it takes time for that to recover. And I had one a couple of years ago where I let the cows in there a little bit too long, and I had to skip that paddock the next time around because it just hadn't regrown because I'd overgrazed it the time before. Environmental conditions, there's nothing we can really do about that, but it's something that affects our production out there. We get into these years where we have cool spring temperatures that can really delay how quickly those pastures grow in the spring. A lot of the West has been in some type of a drought recently. Even if you have irrigated conditions, that's surrounded by dry rangeland or dry farmland, that just sucks that water out, and it's going to affect your production, even though you're putting water on those forages. They're not going to be as productive if everything around it is dry. Again, we've talked about the species. We have a lot of control over that compared to native rangeland. And then those fertilizer inputs. I didn't put a slide in on this, but when it comes to putting on inorganic fertilizers like nitrogen, I typically don't put those on in the spring. It's really hard to keep up with the forage in that spring during that rapid growth period. So why put fertilizer on during that time of the year? I tend to kind of hold my fertilizer inputs till maybe later into June, going into that kind of that summer slump time period, that bottleneck. You're not going to get as efficient use out of that fertilizer, as many pounds of additional forage per pound of N applied, but you can get some stimulation of that growth and help you through that kind of that summer slump time period. Again, especially if you have things like the orchard grass and meadow brome and some of those species that respond very well to those inputs. Then your quantity and quality of irrigation water. Some producers only have that spring water. The quality, does it have salts in it? Those kinds of things can all affect your overall forage production. And then we'll talk a little bit more about pests. And again, thinking about the animal side of things, there's a lot of things that affect that intake, how much is disappearing out there, that size and the type of animals. Is it a growing animal that's, putting on weight? Are these animals that are in lactation? Doesn't matter if you're talking sheep, goats, cows, whatever. If they're in lactation, they're going to have higher intakes, higher need for higher quality forages. Past nutritional regime probably relates more to cattle, like steers that you've roughed through the winter, and then when they hit that green grass in the spring, they're ready to grow, which increases their intake. Ruminants in general, forage quality, higher forage quality leads to higher intake, higher digestibility, quicker passage through that digestive tract. And it's been shown over and over that having adequate water and high quality water will increase the amount of forage that an animal intakes. Supplements, maybe if we're on some stockpiled forages in the later fall, winter time period when the quality is not quite as good, providing some protein supplements or whatever can again keep those rumens functioning, and again will lead to higher intakes. And then environmental stresses, cold temperatures, hot temperatures cause animals to come on and off feed and increase or decrease their intakes. Not going to go into it today, don't have the time, but again, you really have to get that stocking rate or that carrying capacity correct. We don't want to be over here in this area where we're overgrazing. We really don't want to be here where we're undergrazing things either. We kind of want to be here in this middle part, or that moderate grazing, they call it. We'll see a little bit of a decline in the gain per animal here. But again, if you're looking for economics, it's the gain per unit area that's really important, the pounds that you sell per acre when you go to the sale barn. So again, we don't want to be over here in that overgrazed, heavily grazed situation. We want to be just kind of where this peaks here at gain per acre and then back off of that just a little bit. So again, you have to get that correct. And that again kind of tends to change from year to year as we get, again, different environmental conditions and that type of thing. So I wanted to bring this up too. When we're allocating forages and figuring out those stocking rates, there are other things that we need to consider out there. There are other grazers in the system. Things like wildlife, rodents sometimes, insects. I mean, we have years where we have grasshopper outbreaks. That can be an issue. Irrigated pastures is generally less of an impact compared to rangeland, but again, if you have an irrigated pasture surrounded by rangeland where we have an outbreak of grasshoppers, though, I've seen it where they can spill over into that irrigated pasture. Seen wildlife, deer come out of in the evenings into those irrigated areas and graze. So again, all of those things are, you see, some of that forage is disappearing to other grazers. Can have trampling, again, lots of hooves out there. You can have trampling of the forage, fouling by dung and urine. Most animals don't like to eat next to their own dung and urine spots. So, at any point in time, you may have 10% or so of the area that's being impacted by that. Or, it's nice dark green, but the animals aren't eating it because it's, again, it's kind of a built-in mechanism in a lot of species where we don't get parasite transfer. Those kinds of things. Plant maturation and death, typically less of an impact on irrigated pasture because our goal is to keep the vegetation in that kind of that vegetative state of growth, putting out those leaves, and we can control that a lot with our grazing management. Another point here is, again, to keep those plants in a high vigorous state. And if you've heard of, grazing presentations, people talk about the take half, leave half principle. Sometimes I think that's misinterpreted, but for irrigated pastures with a rotational grazing system, I think it really applies. So at any point in time, when we in a grazing period, we don't want to take any more than 50% of the dry matter. So again, so we want to maintain that root growth. We want to maintain that nice vigorous plant out there that has plenty of leaf area to regrow. So we can't take it all, basically. So here's where we can really gain, I think, with rotational systems and this pasture efficiency or harvest efficiency, basically utilization levels. As we go from continuous, where we maybe have 30% seasonal utilization, as we continue to add pastures or subdivisions, we can, see that bump up. When we get up, 24 plus pastures, we may be up 75 to 90% of what we produce out there. We can actually is being actually grazed by the animals. And so when you think about that, if we're producing 8,000, 10,000 pounds per acre, and we can take 75 to 90% of that, we can stock a lot of animals on a small area. I will typically tell people, if they're just getting started with rotational grazing, maybe 5 to 8 pastures or paddock subdivisions is a good place to start. And one of the big ideas behind rotational grazing is this idea of increased stocking density, basically the number of animals per unit of land at a point in time, basically a function of your herd size and your pasture size. But by concentrating animals into smaller units, we're trying to get more even utilization of the forage, and then we rotate those on, so we limit the grazing of that regrowth. So it requires the use of fairly short grazing periods. Then the other kind of positive thing that comes out of that is we get more even distribution of the dung and urine. But I put this figure over here from Utah State. Fairly small paddock. It's only 50 by 70 feet, a couple of animals in there. But where was the water trough? It was up in this corner here. This is where we see, again, a lot of that manure and urine being deposited as close to that water trough. So even in a very small unit, we still see some concentration of that manure and urine there. But this is one of the most important and I think most powerful tools that we have in the toolbox when it comes to grazing management, is this idea of stocking density. So this is just an example of what it kind of looks like. It's just kind of a sea of animals out there, all concentrated in a fairly small area. All right, so when it comes to grazing management, this residual leaf height, we talked about the take half, leave half, 50% dry matter. A big kind of another thing that kind of, I guess, tacks onto that is how much height or forage mass or residual do we want to leave out there? It can depend on the species. Something like bluegrass, it's a short growing species. We can graze it. It's very grazing tolerant, so we can graze that one pretty short, down to 2 inches sometimes. Maybe something like all fescue tends to hold a lot of its leaves kind of close to the soil surface in that crown. So maybe a 3-inch height works all right for tall fescue. But for most species like the orchard grass and like meadow bromes and some of those, a 4-inch height allows us to, maintain enough leaf area that we get, photosynthesis and that fast regrowth. So for most species, we want to remove animals when kind of that average height in the pasture reaches about 4 inches. These are just kind of the general guidelines that I kind of go by. Again, these are just generalized things. Initiate grazing when plants have achieved about 8 inches of growth or regrowth out there in the pasture, and then cease the grazing when we get majority of the plants have been grazed to 4 inches. I would love to find an animal that would stop grazing at 4 inches. You're going to have some plants that are 2, some that are 3, some that are 6, some that are 8. But again, we're kind of looking for the pasture average. Again, this is going to allow us to, again, maintain photosynthesis, leaf area, quick recovery, and vigorous plants. Again, try to have minimal impact on that root growth. And I just put there a quote there from Jim Garish. It says it's almost 4 times as important what the pasture looks like when you take them out as what it looks like when you put them in. So when we talk about rotational systems, again, we're just dividing large pastures into smaller units. Oftentimes we refer to those as paddocks. Again, even small pastures can benefit from subdivision. We typically rotate animals through as one herd. There might be some circumstances where we might have 2, maybe even 3 herds. You might have some thin animals or some growing animals that you want to have first chance at the high quality forage. Put those in ahead of the ewes or whatever. You might have multiple breeding herds, that type of thing. But the goal typically is to divide into enough paddocks to increase the stocking density, to obtain fairly uniform utilization of the majority of the tillers in the pasture, period of occupancy short enough to ensure that individual tillers are not grazed more than once, and then the period of rest long enough for the vegetation to recover and grow at the maximum rate. So again, how many paddocks? I always tell people 2 is better than 1, 3 is better than 2, 4 is better than 3, but where do you stop? What's enough? Again, as a starting point, grazing periods, I typically don't like to see them any longer than 5 to 7 days to avoid major grazing of regrowth. And then I like to see an average anyway of about 30 days rest for our paddocks. So if you take those 2 things in mind, if you have a 6 paddock, 6-day grazing period, that's 36 days to make a complete rotation. So how long would the rest period be? So 5 paddocks times 6, so a 30-day rest period. You have 5 paddocks, 7-day grazing period, that's a 35-day rotation. So that would be a 28-day rest period. So that, to me, this is kind of your base starting point. So this is some information from Jim Garish again. Again, I said 5 to 7 days, but this is what happens when you put animals in as far as their intake. They take the good stuff first, and then as we go through time, they're left with the less and less palatable, less and less nutritious. So their intake tends to go down. If you go with shorter grazing periods, we can maintain a better intake over time, more constant intake over time, which is better for the animals, as far as production wise. So, flexibility is really key in these systems. Move animals fast when the forage is growing rapidly. Maybe shorter rest periods early on, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. As things start to slow down in the summer, we may need to lengthen out that rest period, maybe around 40 days, go with a little bit longer grazing periods. But again, the key is being flexible in these systems. Again, you want to, early on, you might be 18 days, 21 days, 3 weeks, somewhere there. We want to keep those plants on that rapid part of the growth curve here. We don't want to raise them too short, and we don't let them get mature. And again, midsummer, we may be out here, 38, 40, 42 days of rest. When it comes to paddock design, to me, that you need to start with what you have and then build upon that. You don't need to tear everything out and start over. Maybe you need to have a good perimeter fence. I always tell people you need to have a good perimeter fence. And then what happens inside, I use a lot of electric fencing. It's very flexible. I can make different size paddocks, divide things up. Even if I have maybe hard fencing here, I can still come in here with electric fencing and even divide this further. So you just kind of start with what you have and then build upon that. Fencing, there's lots of different types out there. When we get the goats and the sheep, typically some type of a net fencing. We can again use the hard wire, field fencing, woven wire type fencing. Again, we can use the electrified net fencing to divide into smaller units. Maybe 2 to 3 wires of a poly wire. A lot of times, and if the animals get out, if they're on the interior, it's not the end of the world. Okay. Then high tensile works. Here's a unit from Gallagher that it's 4 poly wires, works really well, has posts already built in. I think it's a little over 300 feet of fencing that in those units. Again, very flexible, easy to set up and take down. So I just wanted to, getting your grazing management correct is really key. I stole this, I think, from Chad Cheney at Idaho there when he was extension agent. This idea of when you buy an acre of land, you buy 43,560 square feet of solar panels. So how good's your solar panel? With overgrazed pastures, we don't want to see this with bare ground, and it heats up the soil, dries the soil out, bounces that radiation back into the atmosphere. So you lost photosynthesis. Over here, we have a nice thick stand. So we're capturing as much of that solar radiation as possible. Then I wanted to leave you with one final thing here. This idea of legumes, I like that diverse mixtures, grass legume mixes. I'm a big proponent of that, trying to minimize our inputs of fertilizers. And legumes, they're higher quality, highly digestible, add to production, add nitrogen to the system, a lot of positive things associated with that. But the other thing is how good are they at capturing that solar energy? It's a broadleaf type plant. So here we have some sainfoin, not quite as thick. Here's some bird's foot trefoil, pretty thick. You see the grass coming up, And then when I look at the white clover, again, I really like white clover in irrigated pasture systems. You think of those 3 little leaflets sticking up there, again, that's just a big old solar collector. So another positive thing with having legumes in the system is that capture of that solar energy. Just in summary, again, choose your forages that have that quick regrowth, that are palatable to your animals and going to meet your nutritional needs. Again, those legumes, a lot of positive benefits. add that diversity, fix that nitrogen, high quality, and capture that solar energy. We need to really balance that forage supply with our animal demand. Again, you have to get that carrying capacity correct. Use rotational grazing with relatively short grazing periods. Again, if you're just getting started, 5 to 8 paddocks, and then build upon that. Don't graze any more than 50% of the available forage at any point in time to maintain that vigorous, healthy root system, quick regrowth. Again, part of that goes along with that, again, is to, quit grazing, move your animals when that kind of that average height in the pasture reaches that 4 inches to maintain that leaf area, that photosynthetic factory out there.